The Pusher trilogy is an interesting case study of movies which dive deep into the criminal underbelly of Copenhagen, a place which isn't usually attributed to gangster movies. But other than the setting, what really separates the Pusher trilogy from other gangster flicks is its unique approach in portraying the environment the characters are surrounded by and how it really shapes their identity and their actions. It's a profound introspection into the criminal minds of this world, with each entry having a vastly different perspective from the other. This range in perspective can be seen through the changing ranks of the protagonists, ranging from low-level pushers to high-ranking mobsters. However, the one that I personally find the most fascinating is that in Pusher 2. The second title in the trilogy is told through the perspective of Tonny, a street-level gangster who also appears in the first movie, but takes the helm as protagonist in Pusher 2. And his story is far different from Frank's in Pusher 1, where rather the plot being revolved around high-stakes, edge-of-your-seat action, Tony's tale is more of an observation of the surrounding. A tale where Tony slowly sees the truth about his environment unravel in real time, once he is faced with a natural calling to responsibility, which ultimately triggers his desire for change. Before you can understand Tony's arc and his decisions in the movie, you really have to put yourself in his shoes, and there's no better way to do that than to take a deep look in his surroundings. Not only by the places he situates himself in, but also by the people he socializes with. Fortunately enough, the movie does an excellent job at giving the viewer a profound look into this very criminal underworld by showing the ugliest and most brutally honest sides of it with no bars held. The Copenhagen underbelly is grimy. It's dirty, dangerous, and filled with thugs who commit vast amounts of crime on a daily occurrence. Whether that's dealing drugs, stealing cars, selling dirty firearms, the list just goes on and on. And these are just a few of the criminal instances we get to see in the movie, and it's heavily implied that these characters are used to committing even bigger crimes, such as robbing banks, which Tonny casually suggests at one point.
Jeg har ikke så meget for det der med smerte.
Nå, okay, det er det, jeg står og siger, mand. Lad os droppe det. Lad os tage en bank.
And the thing about it is that within this environment, all of these actions are rewarded. They celebrate their crimes and actually invest in them as they're constantly plotting to commit one crime after another. They are taught that being physically and criminally dominant gives you worth, and showing any sense of emotional vulnerability makes you weak. It's literally a survival of the fittest, as it's a system which encourages toxic masculinity and shuns you out if you are hesitant. The movie also makes it clear that this type of culture is passed down through generations. You can see this with how young children are instantly exposed to this degeneracy and that they're groomed to be raised this way. There's a total sense of negligence when it comes to children. Characters are seen swearing, smoking, and snorting drugs in the same room as Tony's newborn baby. The baby's mother, Charlotte, shows a complete display of indifference towards her child. She only really cares about getting money from Tonny, and every other scene she's in with the baby, she's constantly putting him in harmful circumstances, including leaving him in the middle of a noisy, highly stimulating club so she can do drugs with her friends.
Gider du lige at kigge efter ham? Prøv at høre, han står der.
And speaking about her friends, Gree, who is the newlywed that is celebrating her wedding, is also having a baby on the way, yet she indulges in heavy substances during her pregnancy. In one scene, she wastes herself so much to the point where she even starts bleeding. It's safe to say that children are most definitely unsafe around these people. It just goes to show how people are born and bred in this harmful, poisonous community with no regard towards their actual well-being. Typically, adults should lead by example. Their role in the presence of children is to set good moral values that their children should follow. But unfortunately, the example being set here is nothing but malicious and self-destructive. This theme is explored explicitly through the several father-son relationships in this story. Tonny and his father, the Duke, as well as the Duke and his other son, Valdemar, who is Tonys half-kid brother.
Hey, Valdemar. Kan du huske mig? Tonny? Vi er samme far.
The Duke sits upon the highest rank within the society. He runs a shady automotive business where they resell cars which have been stolen from the street. He's also involved in drug dealing and is also seen conspiring for murder. However, within his surroundings, he's a boss who is respected by many of his co-workers who actually aspire to be like him. So with Tonny being the son of a kingpin, it brings huge expectations upon him. Naturally, he's expected to follow in his father's footsteps and be a fitting heir to his empire. However, in the eyes of the Duke and pretty much everyone else, Tonny is seen as nothing but a failure and a loser. In his way of mitigating this, the Duke dedicates most of his attention to his younger son, Valdemar. This includes exposing him to all the degeneracy he is involved in, including his automotive business, and placing him in adult situations. The Duke sees Valdemar as a second attempt, really, to have a more worthy son who would eventually satisfy his expectations, unlike Tonny, who ended up being the complete opposite of that.
Ej, stop for helvede, mand. Det er speed blandet med rottegift.
The Duke completely despises Tonny. He barely greets him when he gets back from prison, and he instantly assumes the worst in him.
Jeg siger, lad mig se din arm.
Hvorfor?
Ja, jeg skal se, om du har skoldkopper.
He makes fun of him and embarrasses him in front of other friends and family, and he publicly says that he considers a co-worker of his as more of a son than Tonny ever was.
Det vil sige, det er dig, kan man regne med. Det er noget andet end med min egen. Og jeg vil sige, du har en stor fremtid for dig her i familien. Og for mit eget vedkommende, så føler jeg som om, du er min egen søn.
His attitude towards his son's mothers also show his misogyny and disdain towards women. It's very clear that he doesn't care about having a fulfilling marriage with a wife and raise a son, but he only cares about creating the perfect successor to his empire. For example, his reaction to the news of Tonny's mother's death is highly disrespectful, to say the least. To mock the woman who brought you your first child in front of that son is downright evil.
Jeg har hørt, din mor er død.
Nej, er Ellen død?
Ja.
Okay. Ja, hun skulle altid være flink over for mig.
Hun skulle skøre i forhold.
We also learned that the Duke was having a dispute with Valdemar's mom, who was fighting for the custody of her son, which he is entirely frustrated with.
Det er Valdemars mor. Hun tror ham på sikkerheden med politi, hvis ikke hun får forældremyndigheden over. Og du ved, Valdemar, det han siger der alt.
And when Tonny offers to kill her as a form of payment towards his debt, he finds it amusing and actually entertaining, as not only would it solve his dispute, but it was something he would actually be proud of Tonny for. And this scene is so ironic because the Duke is absolutely disgusted by Tonny. Every time he sees him, he looks revolted simply by his presence. His reaction when he found out that Tonny was going to be a father is nothing short of apathetic and of complete dismissal.
Jeg skulle få en unge.
Er du sikker på, det er din?
Det er det, hun siger i hvert fald. En dreng.
Okay, fint.
Yet the thing which was going to make him proud of Tonny is the idea of him killing a woman. And by far, I think the scene which in my opinion ties up the hypocrisy of the Duke as a character is when he fully admits that he believes that he sets a great example as a father.
Tænk dig lidt om, nu skal du til at være et godt eksempel for dit barn, ikke?
Ligesom dig.
Ja, ligesom mig.
It shows how absolutely out of touch he is and how he fully blames Tonny for the way he turned out to be, rather than reflecting on his upbringing with him. The Duke is an evil, narcissistic psychopath who stops at nothing to achieve what he wants. His contemptuous attitude towards his son and other people shows how he only really cares about himself and the legacy he wants to leave behind, which is really a legacy of filth and degeneracy, which he knows he failed with Tonny and is the exact reason as to why he completely hates him. So after taking a look into what Tonny has been dealing with his whole life, it's safe to say that it's a lot. The amount of pure abhorrence that he's surrounded by only serves as a negative influence that he's been raised with. And actually, when you look at it, it only makes sense that he grows up becoming this way, as after years of being exposed to a life of drugs and crime, he's bound to become a product of such environment. In fact, he's made a name for himself for being a career criminal, which we get to see in Pusher 1. His lifestyle is a carefree one, having a happy-go-lucky, devil-may-care attitude towards life, where he doesn't really have a proper job or routine, but he gets his subsistence by dealing drugs on the street with his friend Frank, where they then revel in lavish nightclubs, drinking and doing drugs till sunup. And this is purely the typical behavior of the people he's grown up with. And after witnessing this demeanor in his youth, it's understandable why he would absorb this behavior and it becomes a core part of his personality. When he gets out of prison in the beginning of Pusher 2, nobody really celebrates or congratulates Tonny, especially not his father. And upon getting back from prison, Tonny's main goal was to prove to people that he still has what it takes to be a part of this business, with the main person he wanted to impress, of course, being his father. But when Tonny steals a Ferrari off the street, the Duke is furious, since it's a rare and hot car which could easily be tracked. This attempt by Tonny at proving his worth by stealing a Ferrari is really a dumb one. It was a very impulsive decision, but it really comes off as desperate because he really wants to get on good terms with his father. But instead, he was met with humiliation. And this is just the tip of the iceberg for Tonny's humiliation, as it runs deep through the people around him. Frank gives him the beating of a lifetime after he's manipulated by the cops that Tonny snitched on him, which was most probably not even true. And in Pusher 2, the Duke is the central core of this embarrassment, where he shames Tonny every time he sees him. It doesn't stop there, as even his co-workers and friends embarrass him, like Kurt, who tries to put Tonny to shame multiple times in front of Milo.
Kurt, det er okay. Tonny, han er min ven.
Fuck, mand, din tegning, mand. Sagde jeg ikke til dig, du skulle holde fingrene væk fra minibarn?
Tonny, igen,
Du kan ikke stole på ham der.
Nej.
And one of the most shameful scenes for Tonny, however, is when he's forced to take the bus and is not let to lie in the car trunk since it is illegal to do so.
Nej, den går kraftedeme ikke. Det er pisseulovligt, mand. Du kører ikke rundt med dig hele byen for det. Det gør jeg kraftedeme. Ja, må du sgu tage bussen.
But the ironic thing is that this was said right after an entire car dealership heist, which in my opinion is the epitome of the hypocrisy and toxicity that Tonny is surrounded by. All this just goes to show how the other characters view Tonny as a person meant to be ridiculed. He's the dumb one who nobody really takes seriously and is always expected to mess things up.
Nej, okay, det er det, jeg står og siger, mand. Lad os droppe det. Lad os tage en bank.
Jeg skal ikke tage nogen bank med dig, så går det galt, jo.
Possibly the only time someone gives Tonny something to chew on is found in the opening dialogue.
De havde bare lært at overvinde deres frygt, ligesom jeg lærte at overvinde min frygt i den situation. Sådan som jeg ser på det, så det er i hvert fald en besked, du ikke har fået sendt endnu. Fordi du står simpelthen ikke har lært at overvinde din frygt.
The other prisoner gives Tonny an accurate description of himself, almost like he's psychoanalyzing him. And honestly, after seeing all the stuff he's been through, this is probably the most honest thing anyone has said to Tonny. He's a person who's afraid to burst out of his bubble and be free from this torment. He's scared because he thinks that he'll end up alone and lost with nowhere to go, so he ends up circling back to the same places and people he's used to, even though he knows that they don't want the best for him. This negative space that he's engulfed by has also taken an effect upon his personal life, including his masculinity. Since toxic masculine traits are constantly pressed upon Tonny, he actually finds it hard within himself to maintain such traits, as he struggles to readjust within his surroundings after prison. His inability to get an erection in front of the two sex workers is by far the most literal example of his faltering virility.
Ja, kom. Skiller nu. Jeg er lige ved at få fat i ham, men han er klar, han er klar.
And it's actually ironic because having sexual intercourse was one of the first things on his mind once he got back home, which was also strongly encouraged by one of his co-workers.
Hvad så? Skal du snart have noget af det der, eller hvad? Du må være sulten.
Hvad er det, Sune, der skal have dig?
Kom igennem dem. Vi ses.
But this failed attempt at getting an erection in front of two women is a sign of humiliation for him, as he can't even show his manlyhood.
Vi glipper den der. Kongepikken. Okay?
In fact, the news of this mishap ended up being spread among his peers, making him look even weaker.
Jeg snakker med pigerne. Hvad fanden sker der for dig? De der luder, så du ikke kunne få den op at stå.
Fuck dig, mand. Skal der se en pil? Jeg har fundet til smeden. Ved ikke det. Prøv lige at få den her op.
Den er større end din pik.
Åbn porten, sagde jeg.
Masculinity is something which Tonny struggles with throughout the entire movie, with another prime example being his scene in the club. After his father humiliates him in front of everyone and his own son being dumped like trash in the middle of it, Tonny starts dissociating as the night goes on, which is most exemplified in his iconic scene in the bathroom. This scene is by far Tonny's most self-reflective scene in the entire movie. As he's looking at himself, he's reflecting upon every single choice he's made in his life, and thinking about how he's ended up in this very moment. He looks into the mirror like he's almost looking through his soul. He feels emasculated, disgraced, searching for meaning and direction as he wrestles with his inner demons that have haunted him throughout his entire life. And one can actually draw a parallel with Pusher 1. In Pusher 1, Frank looks at himself confidently. He's checking himself out, getting ready for the day, which is a far cry from Tonny's look of self-shame. But the most notable comparison between Frank and Tonny is seeing what they're surrounded by in these mirrors. Frank's mirror is covered by pictures of iconic masculine roles, which most consider to be toxic. This includes Tony Montana from Scarface and Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver. The fact that Frank has pictures of these characters posted up on his mirror is a reminder to himself of the masculine standard he wants to follow, which he most definitely sees himself in. Obviously, given that he completely missed the point of both these movies. But then when we go back to Tonny, his mirror is empty. It's almost like it's signifying that Tonny doesn't have any masculine role models he wants to follow, and that he himself has ended up in this limbo of self-identity. And also the fact that this mirror scene took place in a nightclub rather than his own home like in Pusher 1 continues to symbolize how foreign Tonny feels to everyone else. He doesn't feel like he's at home, not with these people and not anywhere else, which gives the scene an even more otherworldly look with the vibrant green lighting and the muffled noises of the outside world. He is respected by no one, which is actually the most ironic thing about him considering he has respect tattooed on the back of his head, which is something he himself has never had in his life. At one point in the movie, something happens in Tonny's life which marks the beginning of his eventual turnaround. This is of course when he comes to learn that he is going to be a father, which was totally unplanned and unexpected, where in fact he refuses to accept that it's his. But soon after, and very quickly, he starts growing accustomed to the baby, where he almost forms a fatherly bond instantly.
Hey, hvad sker der, mand? Han går helt amok.
Slap nu af.
Skal han sidde sådan der?
Det er ikke en eller anden flyvemaskine, du ligger og leger med, vel?
This bond between Tony and his baby keeps growing and growing throughout the rest of the movie as Tony starts feeling the weight of his responsibilities as a father. It really is a direct reflection of the other father-son relationships we've seen earlier, including Tony's relationship with his father, as well as the Duke's relationship with Voldemar. The Duke's plan for Voldemar is simply for him to be a better Tony. He wants to correct the mistakes he did when he raised Tony and wants Voldemar to be more like him. Cold, calculated, and a central part of the criminal world he's a part of. But on the other hand, when Tony looks at his son, he really sees himself in all the messed up things that he's been through and how he ended up this way. But unlike the Duke, Tony discerns that he doesn't want the same life he had for his son. He doesn't want him to be around criminals and legal businesses, and he definitely doesn't want him around the same people who do drugs and smoke like a chimney in front of him. This paternal responsibility that Tony has towards his son by far makes Tony the most human character out of everyone. And the scene in the club is Tony at his most paternal, where he wants to protect his son as much as possible, so much so that when Charlotte drops the baby in the middle of the club, Tony is so infuriated by this that he ends up assaulting her.
Prøver du døv eller hvad? Der er af med dig, mand. Let nak, mand.
However, there's something to be said about Tony's reaction to this situation, because it not only shows how he desperately wants to do something about the well-being of his son, but it also portrays his emotional responses to tense scenarios. Of course, his decision to physically assault Charlotte is a deplorable one, and it does not justify his behavior. But this response is really a part of a list of behavioral aspects that he's adopted from the environment he's grown up in. As discussed earlier, toxic masculinity runs through the core of this society. And that brings along the idea that men aren't allowed to show emotional vulnerability. Openly expressing emotions is seen as a weakness, which makes you a liability. Instead, the men are expected to suck it up and move on. However, this type of behavior and mentality only leads to potentially very destructive behavior, which can be seen in this very scene. Since Tony never learned how to express his emotions carefully and confidently, his natural reaction to an emotionally tense altercation was violence rather than communication, which only causes further turmoil. And this is not the only time Tony does this, as he reacts the same way with his father towards the end of the movie.
Hvad var så?
After not going through with his plan to kill Voldemar's mother, Tony receives the ultimate beratement, where his father completely disparages him into nothing.
Kan du bare ikke gøre noget en eneste gang, som alle andre mennesker gør? Hvad? Kan du ikke? Du er ikke til skid, mand.
This obviously greatly disturbs Tony, where his natural response once again is to react violently by murdering his own father.
Nu forsvinder du herfra. Du betyder ikke en skid for mig. Ikke en skid! Fy for satan. Lille lort. Fy for helvede.
And just like before, Tony becomes destructive once again, this time committing patricide, as all the belittling and shame that he's received from his father, not only from this moment but throughout all the years, finally erupts into a bloody and brutal ending. It's his ultimate portrayal of his wariness of this life and how it has consumed him and molded him into becoming the criminal that he is today. Tony murdering his father not only shows how tired he is of his father's incessant shaming towards him, but it's a reflection towards himself in the life that he's had. And it's in this very moment that Tony realizes that enough's enough and that this environment is not suited for him anymore. Whereas before, he was afraid of being shunned by his friends and family if he doesn't comply with their toxic standards, this time he doesn't care about that anymore. And the only thing he wants now is a better life for his son. It's very clear that Tony doesn't fit within this lifestyle. I mean, sure, he's a criminal, but he's not cruel or malicious like his father is. He's not apathetic about his son's well-being like Charlotte, and he doesn't throw his friends under the bus like Kurt and Frank did. He's surrounded by snakes who constantly pick away at him because even they know that he is not like them. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that Tony is going to do an excellent job at being a father himself. And the reason being is that he's never had a good father figure or people to use an example from to begin with. The movie ends in a way where we don't know what Tony's plan is. We don't know where he's going or how he's going to be able to raise his son on his own. But at least both Tony and the viewer feel this sense of relief because we know that his son is way better off without those people. The ending of the movie comes full circle as it ties back perfectly to the very first scene. Tony has finally managed to overcome his fear, to break away from the very shackles that have kept him in this tormented prison of shame and humiliation. He's no longer afraid of being an outcast, because in reality, he's always been an outcast. But this time, he's going out his own way, finally getting the respect that he deserves.